Speaking of cable news, let's get to Kamala Harris with Stephanie Ruhle on MSNBC.
Yes, that's right. Stayed up late last night to watch Kamala Harris on MSNBC's MSNBC Stephanie Ruhle interview. It was approximately a 25-minute interview.
I like how he says it stayed up late and it happened at 7 o'clock.
It did happen. Yeah, that's late. You know? It's late. You shouldn't have a television on at 7 o'clock, all right? If you go to bed at 8 o'clock, the TV's not supposed to be on. It's 2 hours on. Red light glasses. Anyway, we move past that. So Stephanie Ruhle, she has the interview with Kamala Harris. Like I said, approximately 25 minutes. The focus of the interview was on the economy. Now, by and large, this was about as softball as it gets with some mix of serious questions in there. There were no follow-ups or any of that. Nonetheless, there were still some interesting moments. Perhaps the most interesting moment was, hey, you say that you're better for the economy. Polling shows that Trump still looks like he's the one better to handle it. Why do you think that is? Let's take a listen.
The last 4 years, there have been tremendous economic wins, and you've just laid out a big plan. But still, polling shows that most likely voters still think Donald Trump is better to handle the economy. Why do you think that is?
Well, here's what I know in terms of the facts. Donald Trump left us with the worst economy since the Great Depression when you look at, for example, the employment numbers.
It was during COVID, and employment was so high because we shut down the government, we shut down the country.
Even before the pandemic, he lost manufacturing jobs by most people's estimates, at least 200,000. He lost manufacturing plants. Ask the auto workers how he lost auto plants. We have grown over 20 new auto plants. He has an agenda. Let's just deal with it right now going forward, not to mention what happened in the past. He has an agenda that would include making it more difficult for workers to earn overtime, an agenda that would include cutting off access to small business loans for small businesses, an agenda that includes tariffs to the point that the average working person will spend 20% more on everyday necessities and an estimated $4,000 more a year on those everyday necessities, to the point that top economists in our country, from Nobel laureates to people at Moody's and Goldman Sachs, have compared my plan with his and said my plan would grow the economy, his would shrink the economy. Some of them have actually assessed that his plan would increase inflation and invite a recession by the middle of next year. So the facts remain that Donald Trump has a history of taking care of very rich people. And I'm not mad at anybody for being rich, but they should pay their fair share. But tax cuts for the billionaires and the top corporations in our country, and then not really paying much attention to middle-class families.
So obviously it was more of a dodge, and it was like, well, here's what I would do on the economy.
Here's why I'm better. Yeah.
I don't think it's like the worst thing in the world. I am glad that she at least was like, well, look, you know, on unemployment, they love to use this Great Depression line. It's just ridiculous because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and that was the government policy, was to furlough people and put them on unemployment. Whatever, we'll put that aside. The truth is that is probably the best that she can get. Another thing I took notice of is the word Biden was not mentioned once out of her mouth. I actually went back and checked just to make sure. Basically, she is running as far away from Joe Biden as you can without like hurting feelings. I think at this point, she didn't run on she didn't actually mention any of the signature Biden administration policies that have been put into place. None of the American Rescue Plan, nothing about the IRA. It was purely like a looking forward. I think that's smart, actually, just because people do not look fondly at the Biden administration, and they really do blame them. So she's trying to present herself as new blood. Something that I think that it comes back to in the debate was that it always felt like Trump was the incumbent, and it still feels like that right now in this interview. And I think that's what's been a strategic thing that the Trump people have had difficulty with, where they need to try and put her as the face of incumbency and remind people that she's been in office now for 3-something years. Sure, she didn't have any powers to the vice president, but tying her to Biden is the best thing that they could possibly do. And I strategically, I mean, obviously the press, Stephanie in particular, is like in her camp, so she's not going to do that. But that was the framework that I saw that, and I was like, it literally feels like Trump is in office right now, and she's running against that.
Yeah,
when you're not running, you've been in the White House for 3 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, you can point to the media all you want, no doubt about it. And you know, obviously Steph Ruhle, and we'll talk more about this.
Well, we will show you the evidence. Yeah.
They knew that Kamala could get away with dodging almost all the questions.
Especially
and she
on
wouldn't
salt.
really
She'd
get
be like, do you
questioned
support
on
it or not? And she just moves right past it. I'm like, Stephanie, what are we doing here?
Yeah, and I mean, Kamala's good at like delivering the talking points. She did perfectly fine there with here's why I'm better than Donald Trump and Goldman Sachs says my economic plan is better, et cetera, et cetera. But what a more flexible or skilled politician will do when they're dodging a question is not just like from the outset avoid answering it. They'll give some quick nod to an answer and then they'll move into what it is they want to say, right? Like you could say at the beginning of that, listen, he's a businessman and I get it. People just instinctively think that that makes you good on the economy, but here's why they're wrong, blah, 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 blah. And those are the sorts of things that someone who's a little bit quicker on their feet and a little more comfortable in these situations can pull off. And that's why they're very careful about who they put her on with and how often they put her out. Because if you did have an adversarial interview, obviously they're going to follow up. Obviously they're going to try to hold your feet to the fire. Okay, well, what about salt? You didn't answer my question. Well, why do you think it? Okay, that may be fine. You may think you're better than Donald Trump. The voters right now don't agree. So you didn't answer, why you think that is. But she knew that, on MSNBC, with any of the hosts on MSNBC, she wasn't going to get that. And so she was able to just kind of go through her talking points. And so overall, she did fine in this interview. There were no catastrophes because it was a comfortable landscape and on, turf for her to operate on.
Yeah.
One other thing I'll say about the media strategy is it is a little perplexing why, given that it's pretty clear the number one issue that voters have, the voters are still undecided. The biggest issue they have with her is they're still not totally sure what she's gonna do. So you would think it'd be like, okay, if you're not comfortable with Kamala, at least put Tim Walz out there, every day on cable news. He's comfortable in these settings, day after day after day, saying, here's our top 3 item. It's gonna be housing, it's gonna be the child tax credit, it's gonna be the small business, whatever the 3 things they wanna hit again and again and again. I don't know why they don't do that. At least with Tim Walz. I kind of get it with Kamala because they're just nervous that she's going to screw it up and she might, right? But to me, that strategy, it's way too cautious. And then it makes all of these settings so much higher stakes for her when she does actually give an interview, even with a friendly.
The entire media was watching this interview. Why? Because there's not that many interviews. So that's the risk, is that Trump does the flood the zone strategy. He's constantly, even though he's doing way less rallies and all these other things than previously, he still does a decent number of rallies. Last night, he actually made major news on Ukraine in his speech. My point is only just that people are not glued to the screen every single time Trump talks, because Trump talks a lot more than her on average and will eventually do media, press conferences, and all that. With Kamala, she's the one where it's a self-inflicted wound when you set up set-piece events and it just goes okay. And that's kind of how I would characterize this. I think it was okay. But if the number one reason that these uncommitted voters are wondering, should I vote for you or not, a lot of it comes down to policy and actually answering questions, feeling you have command. And I didn't get a lot of that, especially if we look at the specifics on some of her flagship proposals. She has a few memorized. She's like $25,000 down payment assistance, $50,000 small business. But then Stephanie Rule's like, so what about the SALT deduction? Nope, we're not talking about that. On taxes, she does the totally vague thing where she's just like, nobody under $400,000 a year will have their taxes raised. I'm like, well, what does that mean? It's like, do you mean you're going to increase the individual rate over 400,000? Does that mean you're actually, then she said 100 million Americans will get a tax cut. Well, a tax cut how? How from the TCJA? Which specifically do you think you want to do? On the manufacturing stuff, she's like against tariffs, but she's very pro building American manufacturing. I'm like, well, that's pretty, doesn't really work out. And actually, even Stephanie Rule was like, come on, even Joe Biden has kept a lot of tariffs and increased tariffs while he's in office. So there's a lot of weird, ideology does not mix. There's a lot of talking points. I saw some of that in the price control answer, where again, basically zero specifics on any of this. It was a lot of just righteous indignation, which is fine. I mean, look, you're a politician, but I still think Americans are asking you for something. So just to show you, this is what she had to say.
But a serious problem over the last few years has been inflation. Luckily, it's cooling, but prices are still high.
Yeah, I agree with you.
You said you want to take this on by going after those who engage in price gouging.
Yeah.
But as somebody who supports free markets, who's a capitalist, How do you go after price gouging without implementing price controls? Because once we get in this zone, people start to get worried and they say, I don't know what she stands for.
So just to be very frank, I am never going to apologize for going after companies and corporations that take advantage of the desperation of the American people. And as Attorney General, I saw this happen. In the midst of an emergency, whether it be an extreme weather event or even the pandemic, we saw it, where those few companies, not the majority, not most, but those few companies that would take advantage of the desperation of people and jack up prices. Yeah, I'm going to go after them. Yes, I'm going to go after them. And that is part of a much more comprehensive plan on what we can do to bring down the cost of living, including housing, including the everyday needs of the American people.
So what did you think of that, Krystal? Because the way I would answer that question is when a lot of undecided voters say that I think you're too liberal and somebody tees it up for you, she should have said something like, do you think Arkansas are socialist? Because they have price gouging laws that are on the books. And that is the framework that I will use to make sure that people pay less at their grocery store. This was just, I don't know. There's nothing going on there.
I mean, your answer is good, but to be honest with you, I thought this was a great answer. Because normally I would expect her to kind of back down. Oh, well, you know, I'm free market and do the whole like, oh, and Dick Cheney endorsed me, don't worry, I'm not a socialist.
We'll get to that. That was in the speech.
I actually thought that this was a fantastic answer. It was like, because Stephanie Ruhle is like CNBC on MSNBC. Very closely, like Wall Street aligned. I don't know if you guys remember, she was so mad at Joe Biden for going after Park Avenue in one speech where he sounded some populist notes. Like that's her orientation. So I was worried in this interview that Kamala would be looking too much to cater to that Wall Street orientation. And this answer, while yes, vague, and as like someone who's wonky and wants to know the specifics, et cetera, doesn't get into that whatsoever. But as a political answer, I actually thought it was fantastic. I'm not gonna back down. I'm not gonna be cowed. When people are taking advantage of the American people, I'm gonna go after them. I'm gonna be tough on them. That's what I did as Attorney General. And to me, that's not even like really a left-right thing. It's more of just like, squarely leaning into a populist orientation. So personally, I thought this was one of her better answers, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I don't know. I just keep coming back. I understand where you're coming from. The more that I look at that and people are like, I think you're too liberal, I do think that this, and the Dick Cheney stuff, I don't think that that works for the whole I think you're too liberal. That's not something that people who are concerned about that are. What they're kind of looking at is probably both cultural, and I think that the Arkansas framework, or even some sort of specifics, you could allay those concerns. She did show a lot of ideological flexibility in her speech. I'm not sure if you caught that.
Oh, yeah. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But this answer would poll at like 80%.
Sure.
I mean, if you look at the price gouging, her price gouging policy, it was literally supported by like 80% of people. So I don't think people think of this as like a liberal issue. I think they see it as like, you're standing up for us, you're taking on, and it's been the case throughout the pandemic, even at the height of inflation. The American people were much more likely to blame greedy corporations than actually the Biden administration was. So for me, for her to lean into that and actually, you know, put some oomph behind it and not back down, even in the face of a somewhat adversarial question from Stephanie Ruhle, you know, I was heartened to see that, and I thought it was a great answer. I thought politically, I thought she was on very, you know, strong ground there.
Sticking with the MSNBC thing, regardless of how maybe one answer or not, one reason that they decided to pick Kamala Harris was, or sorry, Stephanie Ruhle, was because literally just days ago, she was on Bill Maher's show defending Kamala for not doing interviews, and by the way, after the interview was conducted, gave a glowing spot about how incredible she did in the interview. So just to give you a taste of who the interviewer herself was and what she most recently said, here it is.
It's not too much to ask Kamala, say, are you for a Palestinian state if Hamas is going to run that state?
Okay.
Yes or no?
And let's say you don't like her answer. Are you going to vote for Donald Trump?
No, I'm not.
Kamala
I just said I'm not going to vote for her.
Harris is not running for perfect. She's running against Trump. We have two choices. And so there are some things you might not know her answer to. And in 2024, unlike 2016 for a lot of the American people, we know exactly what Trump will do, who he is, and the kind of threat he is to democracy.
I don't know.
So it's unclear to me how there could be an informed.
The problem that a lot of people have with Kamala is we don't know her answer to anything, okay?
But you know his answer to everything.
And that's why I would never vote for him, and people shouldn't vote for him. But people also are expected to have some idea of what the program is of the person you're supposed to vote for. You're just not supposed to say, well, you have to vote for Y because X is this, that, and the other. Let's find out a little bit more. And I don't think it's a lot to ask her to sit down for a real interview as opposed to a puff piece in which she describes like her feelings of growing up in Oakland with nice lawns.
Then I would just say to that, when you move to Nirvana, give me your real estate broker's number and I'll be your next door neighbor. We don't live there.
So there's your taste. Basically, not only does she openly support Kamala Harris, she was defending her for not doing interviews and for not having specifics.
As
the
a
best
journalist,
part,
that's so embarrassing.
that's humiliating. The best part, Krystal, is that afterwards, there was this weird, after the interview aired, Stephanie was on with Chris Hayes. And of course, I stayed up. I was like, okay, I'll keep watching this. And she was like, you know what you had there? It was a real interview. It was a normal interview. If you're worried about taxes, you got your answer right there. I'm like, no, you didn't. Saying I won't raise your taxes under 400K is the most meaningless sentence in all of politics. Joe Biden said that. I'm pretty sure Donald Trump has said something, a version of that. Why should I believe you? What are you even talking about? So for her in particular, to be a financial journalist whose entire job is literally about the specifics and all of this, to have done this spot and then get the interview confirmed with you, 2 days later, that's humiliating. And it's also humiliating for the network because they were touting this as like some big news-making event. And I was like, this is ridiculous. The whole thing is a farce.
I mean, okay. If you're just a political analyst and you're saying, you know what, I don't know that the voters really care that much about like the white paper on her policies.
That's fine.
You know what? That might be true.
Yeah.
That might be true.
If you're Quentin Tarantino, that's fine, right?
Although I do think that she's not even really right on that because there is still this lingering sense of I really want to know what the priorities are. Right? I need to know. It's not even so much about the policy details. It's just like who are you? At your core, what are you going to fight for? What is the day one agenda? What is it really? That's the thing that still needs to be filled in. So I don't even totally agree with the political analysis. But as a journalist, as someone who's supposed to actually care about what are the policies that are going to be enacted, what's it going to mean for business? What is it going to mean for small business? What is it going to mean for regular people? How can you not push to get those answers? Because remember, this isn't someone who went through a primary process where we got to see debates, where she got to be pressed by other would-be contenders on a debate stage. None of that happened. So all we have are these little glimpses of whatever it is they're gonna, they deign to give us. And those answers can end up being very consequential if she is actually elected president. Even if it isn't what everybody in the country is, checking off their list, as Stephanie Ruhle talks about at the end of that video, if you keep going. Even if it's not that, student debt is a perfect example. Biden made certain promises on student debt that once he got in office, he clearly did not want to do anything on student debt. But because he had repeatedly promised certain things on the campaign trail, activists had a cudgel that they could wield to at least force him to try to do something. And they did alleviate some student debt. Now, he still didn't go as far as his campaign promises, and there's a whole reason, they would blame it on the Supreme Court. We won't get into all of that. But it's pretty clear to me, if he hadn't been forced to make those pledges on the campaign trail, he wouldn't have done any of it because he clearly didn't want to. So, it matters that you get her on the record on some key issues so that can be used if she is president, where you can say, hey, you promised to do this. You promised you wouldn't do that. Why are you proposing this now? And that sort of pressure can actually effectuate some kind of change. So to just throw up your hands and I don't even care. Why should we even try? I mean, the opponent's Donald Trump. It's just, it's pathetic. Like I said, it's embarrassing. And, I suspect that this interview with Stephanie Ruhle was probably already in the works before this Bill Maher appearance happened.
But it certainly doesn't hurt, right?
It's illustrative of why she's chosen, right? It's illustrative of why she's chosen. And then the other reason she's chosen is because Kamala Harris realizes, okay, I think people who are going to vote on abortion, they already know who they're voting for. People who are going to vote on immigration, they already know who they're voting for. The remaining undecided voters, by and large, sure, there's exceptions, but by and large, it's going to be about the economy. She has somewhat closed the gap from where Joe Biden was vis-a-vis Trump. We actually have a Washington Post tear sheet we can put up.
A7.
This is A7, guys. So Trump had a 12-point lead over President Biden on who would be better suited to handle the economy. He now averages only a 6-point edge on the economy, which is actually pretty solid for a Democratic candidate, especially against Donald Trump. Fox News poll found 51% of registered voters favor Trump on the economy compared with 46% who favor Harris. There's a number of other polls they cite here that show similar shifts towards her, even though he still holds somewhat of an edge. So the other reason Stephanie Ruhle gets chosen is because she is a financial journalist. She does have more of an economic focus, and it pairs with this Pittsburgh economic speech that Kamala Harris delivered on the same day.
Yeah, that's right. Let's get to some of that speech. We have one clip of it here on manufacturing. Let's take a listen.
Now, look, my opponent, Donald Trump, well, he makes big promises on manufacturing. Just yesterday, he went out and promised to bring back manufacturing jobs. And if that sounds familiar, it should. In 2016, he went out and made that very same promise about the Carrier plant in Indianapolis. You'll remember, Carrier then offshored hundreds of jobs to Mexico under his watch. And it wasn't just there. On Trump's watch, offshoring went up and manufacturing jobs went down across our country and across our economy. All told, almost 200,000 manufacturing jobs were lost during his presidency, starting before the pandemic hit, making Trump one of the biggest losers ever on manufacturing.
Not bad. I thought it was overall like a fine enough answer. I won't, go into all the specifics, whatever. But I think what it comes back to is not just the lean in of the speech. Keep in mind that was the Economic Club of Pittsburgh. That interview was also conducted in Pittsburgh. This is what they're leaning into, especially there. They had the steelworkers endorsement. There was actually an interesting question to Kamala on the steelworkers and whether that U.S. steel plant should have been sold to Nippon Steel, which the Biden administration has decided to block. That's a policy that she came out in favor of. So I thought that was interesting. We have one more section here that we can play from the speech. Let's take a listen.
As president, I will be grounded in my fundamental values of fairness, dignity, and opportunity. And I promise you, I will be pragmatic in my approach. I will engage in what Franklin Roosevelt called bold, persistent experimentation. Because I believe we shouldn't be constrained by ideology and instead should seek practical solutions to problems, realistic assessments of what is working and what is not.
I thought that was interesting. The practicality, access of, that is actually what I expected more from her. And listen, we're put my own politics and how I think about things to the side. I think that probably is on the mark of what people want to hear from her. The undecided economic voter is like, oh, I'm not ideological, I'm practical. People like that idea. Practical often meets billionaire brother-in-law who's the counsel for Uber, but whatever, we'll put that to the side. My point is that rhetorically, I didn't think it was the worst thing. And that is something, of course, you also get a lot of elite donors and other people who've been in her ear who are like, this is what you need to say. So it was an interesting little flash in terms of the interview, particularly the price gouging answer, like you said, but then also the way that she talks at the Economic Club of Pittsburgh. By the way, anything Economic Club is like full on the business community, Rotary
Chamber
Club.
Of Commerce,
yeah, it's like Chamber of Commerce type thing. And that's typically where these types of speeches are given.
It gives a little bit of Hillary Clinton, like, I'm a progressive who gets things done.
That was a great moment.
It does give a little bit of that. Listen, if you're going to nitpick, you say okay, FDR is representative. She's citing FDR there, and he is representative of a very specific, ideological frame, one that I wholly support, and one that a good number of her policies also are quite in line with, and some of the Biden era policies as well, in terms of domestic economics. But then she's also claiming, I'm not ideological. You can see the poll testing of some people say you're too liberal. You need to position yourself as this sort of tough, pragmatic, just competent figure, and so that's what she seeks to do in that speech. I watched the whole speech. I thought it was pretty solid. She threw on it in terms of her contrast with Trump. The clip we showed you vis-a-vis manufacturing was a kind of a good example of the contrast she seeks to set up.
Yes, that's what
we saw a lot of this, in the debate, in her DNC speech, et cetera, where it's like, he's for the rich, I'm for the middle class. She had this line about, he's for the people who work in the skyscrapers, I'm for the people who build the skyscrapers, which I thought was a pretty good contrast. And so that's what she's trying to set up. With regard to, what she talked about there with the carrier plan, I don't know if you guys remember that at the beginning of Trump's term in office back in 2016, and there was a whole, he made a big show of trying to save these jobs at the carrier plant, and then after all the fanfare dies, they get outsourced anyway. And there's a few failures you can point to like that. Lordstown being another one where a lot of promises were made to people, and he didn't care enough to really follow through, pay attention, and that fell apart. The Foxconn facility in Wisconsin is another one. Her numbers are correct in terms of manufacturing under him versus under Biden. And it's particularly relevant right now because, Saagar, you probably saw this. Right now, Trump is doing it's a very carrier-esque move, sort of trying to recapture some of those 2016 populist vibes where he's threatening John Deere with a 200% tariff if they move war production to Mexico in particular. And so she's trying to point out, like, yeah, we've heard this before, but it never actually works out the way that he says because he doesn't follow through. He doesn't have a plan. He's not doesn't actually care about this stuff. It's just a show. So anyway, that's the contrast she's trying to set up. The one thing I'll say about the limited media strategy, which I think is abhorrent for democracy, one thing they might be betting on is because there's like a scarcity of Kamala, it does mean that those speeches, this interview with Stephanie Ruhle, et cetera,
become flagships.
Get more coverage. Like, we watched it and we covered it, in a way that, another Trump interview on Fox News would be like, if something really pops, we'd cover it. But because there is such a scarcity of Kamala, all of these things become bigger events and become a bigger deal. That may be part of the calculus that's going into this as well.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.